Oh, don't. Good morning. Wow, it's good to see you again. it is simply amazing and actually nice how few of you I've heard from during the registration process. Something must be working better than it used to. Or you didn't register and you just came anyway, whichever, welcome. I want to make sure you know that once you're registered for everything, whether you picked a lecture or not. And I say that because we have some well-known presenters on the docket for this week, whose names you'll be familiar with: Stephen Benoit, Guy Gudici, and others. But we also have some new people, and like our presentation this morning, new presenters, and um, and as you look at the lectures that are coming up, often it seems, if you don't know the person or if the topic seems a little less than thrilling or whatever, we don't have as many registrations. But I can assure you that that everyone who will be coming this week is worth listening to, whether you think you're going to be interested or not. I'm saying this in part because I had an hour coffee with with James Pike, who's going to be presenting on AI. And and AI is something that we hear so much about that it's kind of like not another lecture on AI. James Pike talked for an hour, and I talked for 5 minutes, and he is so interesting because he's working at the highest levels of AI, the billion-dollar industries that are looking into the future. And he said, you think you understand what's coming. You think you know what's around the bend. You think that because your washing machine has a chip in it, you understand AI, but you have no idea how it's going to transform our world. So I would encourage you, if you're here on a given day anyway, take in both lectures, and otherwise just come and see what people are presenting. It's a great lineup. The curriculum committee has done a lot of screening and a lot of looking at different possibilities and put together what I think is going to be a really fun program. Starting with this one, where is Judy? Don't you love it that we've gotten this far without a joke?
Good morning. My name is Judy Filson, and I'm the classroom assistant for this Dr. Michael Cooper. He's a professor of music at Southwestern University. He has written articles and books about numerous aspects of music in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, including Dvorak, Richard Strauss, percussion performance practices, and the musical lives of American utopian communities. Did I say that right? Okay. And is the author of the Historical Dictionary of Romantic Music, which came out in the second edition earlier this year. He is also the author of the first book-length study of music of Margaret Bonds, which was published in December 2023 by Cambridge University Press, and the first book-length biography of Bonds, which is currently at press with Oxford University Press. The biggest project of his career, though, has been the project of publishing music of Margaret Bonds and her friend Florence Price that had been relegated to the archives because of their race and their sex. That project has currently yielded more than 100 published scholarly editions of previously unknown music, with many more to come yet. And with that, Dr. Bonds has asked if you would hold your questions to the end, and we'll come up and we'll have a mic. So if you would do that, Dr. Michael Cooper. Oh, would you turn your cell phones off, please, or the sound off? Thank you.
Hello, and thank you, Judy. Can you guys hear me well enough? A little louder, okay. I'll try to holler. So the first thing I need to tell you is that, as we've already noted, uh, there are technological issues. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. Those who live by technology die by technology. And we've already run into some of those problems this morning, with the result that you're going to have to deal with me as we go along here saying click, which is my instruction for the slide to advance back there at the back of the room. So I'm very sorry for those disruptive clicks. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here with LLGTX, and I hope you'll enjoy the time we have together. Click. See what I mean? I'm here today, click. Sometimes I say it more than once. There we go. Okay. I'm here today to talk to you about one of the greatest and most unswervingly original composers, black or white, male or female, of all of 20th century music, Margaret Jeanette Allison Bonds. She was a composer, pianist, public speaker, and social justice warrior who was widely known in her lifetime, but has been marginalized since her death, and one who has been getting increased attention in recent years. Click. There we go. Which is why I'm here today, to teach you a little bit about who Margaret Bonds was, what she worked for, what her music is like, and what her life and work mean for us today. In what follows, we'll look at Margaret Bonds' life in terms of 4 professional and creative periods. Click. The first of these will be based in the early years in Chicago up until October of 1938. Click. Then we'll turn to her decision to begin anew, based in New York, and continue up through the landmark performance of the first version of her Christmas cantata, The Ballad of the Brown King, in December of 1954. In the third section, we'll continue the wave of, click, by the way. In the third section, we'll continue the wave of projects and multi-pronged international successes that she achieved between 1955 and 1967. Click. And in the fourth section, we'll see, click, please. You see what I mean about this? This is just so exciting. Okay, and in the fourth section, we'll see how the tragedy of the Watts Rebellion in Los Angeles, combined with Bonds' established success, her belief in the thriving artistic culture of Southern California, and her commitment to working with progressive politics on behalf of freedom and justice for communities of color, especially African Americans, to compel her to leave her New York successes behind and resettle in Los Angeles in 1967. Click. I'll close with some remarks that I hope will sum up the larger lessons of Margaret Bonds' extraordinary life and music. Click. Let's get started. Margaret Bonds was born and raised in one of the most resolutely segregated northern cities in the United States, Chicago, to parents who were themselves history makers. Click. And actually another click here, please. Her father, so 2 clicks. Yeah, there we go. Her father, Monroe Alpheus Majors, was a medical doctor, journalist, and political activist who also founded Texas' first professional association for Black doctors and became the first Black physician to work west of the Rockies. Click. And then another click, please. Her mother, Estella Bonds, born in New York, was her first music teacher and also the organist and music director of Chicago's historic Berean Baptist Church for most of her life. She married Dr. Majors in 1909, and in 1913, the same year in which Margaret Bonds was born, she helped found Chicago's Coleridge Taylor School of Music. As we'll see, she was also a founding member of the National Association of Negro Musicians, NAM. Click. The Bonds Majors' marriage ended in annulment, click, in mid-1919, when Margaret Bonds was 6 years old. On June 9th of that year, around the time of that annulment, young Margaret gave her first documented public performance, click. And the Chicago-based African-American National Weekly, The Broad Axe, singled her out for special notice in a little story about that performance. Click. More important than that performance for Margaret Bonds in the long term, though, was were two other events that took place in 1919. The first of these was what came to be known as the Chicago Race Riot, which began on July 27th, 1919, when 17-year-old Eugene Williams drifted into unofficial waters on the 31st Street beach on Lake Michigan, unofficial whites-only waters on that beach, and drowned after being stoned by angry white beachgoers. White police officers refused to arrest the person who had thrown the fatal stones, and in response to Black protestations, the city's white population attacked. 13 days later, 87 were dead, 537 were injured, and at least 1,000 Black Chicago families were homeless. Click. That riot engulfed the click, please. Okay. That riot engulfed the neighborhood where the Bonds family home stood. But aside from that, the rebellion was in full swing on July 29th, 1919, when African-American musicians from around the United States gathered in that same neighborhood for what would become the first meeting of the National Association of Negro Musicians, NAM. And Estella Bonds, mother of Margaret Bonds, was a member of that founding group. You see her here in this picture. As a result, 6-year-old Margaret Bonds not only found herself in a racial danger that no child should ever know, but also saw that her mother was willing to brave significant racial peril in order to contribute to the founding of NAM. Estella Bonds' bravery would have taught her young daughter that NAM was a vitally important organization for the cause of Black music, an organization whose meetings she ought always attend, and she did, even at great personal cost. Such was the importance of cultivating and celebrating the Black music and Black musicians that the white world regarded with disdain. Click. Margaret Bonds herself was a musical prodigy. By age 8, she was writing her own songs, and during the 1920s, she took lessons with, enjoy this barrage of clicks, click, Tom Theodore Taylor, William Levy Dawson, Lawrence Price, click, click, and especially important in Bonds' view, click, click, Will Marion Cook and Abby Mitchell. Every one of these folks is a significant musician in their own right. Margaret Bonds herself was the musical prodigy of those particular people. Click. That musical education was combined with a public education at the progressive Parker High School in Chicago, where Bonds was a member of the Song Committee, click, the Equestrian Club, click, the French Club, click, and of course the orchestra, click. Among other things, her senior portrait bears the tagline, "Hats off to Marg when she plays the piano," click. By December of 1929, she had made such an impression on all that, click, the national edition of the Chicago Defender ran a photo of a smiling young Margaret Bonds titled Prodigy. The story explained that a number of teachers had, quote, taken up the cause of Margaret Bonds, musical genius, as their own, end quote, and would present her in recital, hoping to establish a scholarship fund that would enable her to continue her musical studies. Click. So it was that Margaret Bonds began the last decade of her Chicago years by enrolling at the nominally integrated Northwestern University, a long train ride north of the family home on the south side of the segregated metropolis. Click. At Northwestern, she studied piano with Emily Boettger, who had herself graduated from Northwestern just 2 years earlier, click, and she gave 2 very demanding recitals. These are recitals that are daunting for musicians everywhere today. And by the time, click, she had reached age 20, her recognition as pianist was so great that she was invited to perform with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra at the Chicago World's Fair on June 15th, 1933. That was just 12 days after she received her bachelor's degree. And that performance made Margaret Bonds the first African-American pianist and the first African-American woman to feature as soloist with the all-white and all-male orchestra. Click. In the meantime, though, she had also enrolled in courses on art song and vocal composition with Carl Milton Beecher at Northwestern and found that she was a composer and a good one. Click. These years yielded a setting of Frank Dempster Sherman's popular, click, 1892 psychological parable poem, The Sea Ghost, that won first prize in a national competition in 1932. bringing the aspirant composer more attention in the national African-American press and a much-needed infusion of $250 in cash. That's the equivalent of about $5,250 today, a substantial prize. But at Northwestern, Margaret Bonds also learned another life lesson, one that she would work to address in every aspect of her life to the end of her days. This concerned the power of race and racism in American life. She learned that her home had shielded her from many of the forces of anti-Black attitudes in U.S. customs and law, and that even a nominally integrated university, such as Northwestern, still had and would gladly wield the power to deny her the freedom and equality to which she was entitled. She was as ostracized could be. The general curriculum included no Black authors or scholars. The music curriculum included no Black composers. She was the only Black student in either of her graduating classes, and she learned, in other words, that the dangers that she faced because of her race during her childhood were just overt manifestations of a dehumanizing anti-Black attitude that was built into every facet of her life as a Black woman in Chicago. So much so that she would later describe Northwestern as a, quote, cesspool of white supremacy, bigotry, and prejudice. Click. Nevertheless, Margaret Bonds continued her work at Northwestern, and she completed her master's degree in piano there in 1934. Click. After the latter, she again assumed the national stage, performing at the National Convention of NAMM in August of 1934. Click. And then in October of that year, she performed again at the Chicago World's Fair, this time with the Women's Philharmonic of Chicago and the orchestral version of Florence Price's Piano Concerto in What Movement. And there you see young Margaret Bonds at the piano in that performance. Click. After graduating, she undertook a series of collaborative performances that took her and her fellow artists around the United States and deep into the dangers of the Jim Crow South, where African Americans were in serious peril with no legal rights if they ran into trouble. Click. And she learned that she loved teaching. By the time she finished Northwestern, she was teaching private piano lessons, and in 1938, she founded an interdisciplinary institute on Chicago's South Side titled the Allied Arts Academy. This was a venture that, because of the geography of the segregated city, was expressly dedicated to making self-actualization through the arts accessible to younger African Americans, a charge that would remain a part of Bonds' identity to the end of her life, most notably in her final years in Los Angeles. Click. What tied all these lessons together was poetry, the poetry of Click, County Cullen, Click, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Click, and especially Langston Hughes. These clicks are really distracting. By her own account, Hughes's poetry, particularly The Negro Speaks of Rivers, had revealed to her the inherent beauty of her Blackness and the great strength, dignity, and wisdom of her Black heritage, in the process corroborating everything her parents had taught her about racial pride. Click. That poetry then became more poetry when Margaret Bonds set Hughes's The Negro Speaks of Rivers to music. Click. When she finally met Hughes, in early 1936, she would show this song to him to his great admiration. Here's the first page of the earliest surviving manuscript for that song. In 1938 and 1939, she took this song on tour. And although these performances did not as yet result in the work's publication, the song's powerful and profoundly sensitive rendering of Hughes's iconic poem resonated deeply with audiences everywhere it was heard. Margaret Bonds became the voice of Langston Hughes in song. More generally, too, Hughes's commitment to using his art to lifting up Black voices and Black art and bringing about social change mirrored Bonds' own. Click. And this kinship of spirit encouraged Margaret Bonds in the formulation of what I, drawing on Bonds' own terminology, call the Bonds mission, a multi-pronged, decades-long interdisciplinary enterprise that defied the racist and sexist limitations that her world imposed on non-whites and women and worked to achieve social justice through the alliance of performance, composition, and other art forms with a commitment to social engagement. Click. Margaret Bonds was now ready to take the national stage. Click. With Hughes, she penned the beautiful and still unpublished song That Sweet Silent Love, Click. And in 1937 or 1938, Bonds began collaborating with two New York-based musicians, Joe Davis and Andy Rotzoff, who were famous from their collaborations with Fats Waller and songs such as Ain't Misbehavin' and Honeysuckle Rose. These collaborations produced her first hit popular song, Click, Peachtree Street, which was published in New York in April of 1939 and memorably recorded by the Milt Hearth Trio, Woody Herman, Harry James, and several others. Here's an excerpt from that early hit as recorded by the Milt Hearth Trio in 1939. Click.
When you want to reach me, just remember Peachtree. Got to say goodbye because I'm on my way, going back to Peachtree Street in OGA. I wish that you could be there when they welcome me there. Know that I will cry for joy on that great day when I greet my favorite street in gay GA. Peachtree Street, happy street I played on. Peachtree Street, I never felt afraid on. You can have your Broadways and your boulevards. When compared with Peachtree Street, they're just backyards.
As a native of Atlanta, I still love that song, just for lots of reasons. Okay. With all these pieces in play, as the 1930s ended, Margaret Bonds was poised to take center stage as one of her generation's most exciting emergent talents in the spectacular flourishing of African-American culture and intellectual life, known at the time as the New Negro Movement. She had extraordinary intelligence, talent, and energy, a strong education, and an excellent reputation as teacher and performer. And she had established herself as a savvy and successful entrepreneur, even in the harsh realities of the Great Depression. Aside from the challenges posed by the racism and sexism of her world, only one major problem remained. Margaret Bonds wanted to be a publishing composer, and Chicago was home to relatively few music publishers. Think. So she left Chicago. She left Chicago and began anew in New York with a strategy that in retrospect makes perfect sense. Working with Davis and Rotzoff, she would get her foot into the door of the music publishing industry through popular song, whose publishers were less trenchantly racist than those of classical music. Concurrently, she would take advantage of New York's relatively integrated performance opportunities for African Americans and have her art songs and arrangements of spirituals performed that way. Then, with her name's commercial viability established in print through popular song and her classical reputation established in performance, she would be able to secure publication of her art songs and other classical pieces through New York's bustling music publishing industry. Click. Meanwhile, she had also taught and worked as music copyist, editor, and arranger. Click. And she met a fellow Midwesterner named Lawrence Larry Richardson, who worked as a probation officer and had a modest but dependable income even in Depression-era America. Click. The two married on Bonds' 27th birthday, March 3rd, 1940, and she wrote this song for that occasion. Click. And in 1946, they had a daughter, Dion. The three would remain a tight-knit and loving family to the end of Margaret Bonds' life. Click. Margaret Bonds' strategy was working beautifully. Click. Already in November of 1939, just after her move to New York, she published the hit song Georgia. Click. And in April of 1940, click, just a month after her marriage, she composed several numbers for a review that Hughes was writing for the American Negroes Exposition back in Chicago. Click. In November of 1940, she composed her earliest surviving setting of a spiritual, the still unpublished Nebuchadnezzar, which is actually set to come out later this summer. Throughout it all, she taught and concertized, lauded in the African-American press for her programs that ranged from nightclub, ballet, and music theater through to classical concerts that featured music by Bach, Brahms, César Franck, Robert Schumann, and others, alongside her own classical compositions and spiritual settings. Click. Oh, and come on. An important milestone came in April of 1941 when soprano Hortense Love invited her to compose 5 spirituals that circulated among the so-called Creek freedmen of Love's native Oklahoma. And those settings, which Bonds herself termed revolutionary in their harmonic structure, established the new approach to spiritual composition that would become a hallmark of Bonds' style to the rest of her life. We'll return to the first spiritual of this set, Dry Bones, a little later. In the meantime, to give you a taste of the remarkable fusion of spiritual, gospel, and art song that Margaret Bonds had formulated, here's a clip from another spiritual in that same set, You Can Tell the World, a phrase to which we'll return at the end of these remarks. Over the next decade, Margaret Bonds would conquer New York in every arena that she worked in, click. But after the tragic attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, click please, her agent convinced her that her husband and she, her agent convinced her and her husband that she and pianist Calvin Jackson should join more than 1 million other African Americans in the massive West Coast economic surge spurred by armaments factories and military activity there, providing entertainment for the tired and thirsty men and women of the armed forces and the many factory workers on the West Coast. The venture was successful for Margaret Bonds, but it was also difficult, and Margaret Bonds learned that California's political structure was dominated by white people who used housing covenants, restrictions on the use of public facilities, school segregation, and the other familiar tools of United States systemic racism to ensure that blacks would have to fight to achieve any measure of freedom and equality they were to get. As a result, Margaret Bonds returned to New York in March of 1943. She was discouraged, but more determined than ever to pour everything she had into using her God-given talent and energy to fight inequality and work for the betterment of others' lives. Click. A set of professional reflections written around 1950, click, shows that in the early 1940s, she had become dissatisfied with her pianistic technique and had thus undertaken 6 seasons of lessons with renowned pianist Diane Lavoie-Herz, a student of the great Russian virtuoso pianist and composer Alexander Scriabin. Margaret Bonds took pride in having passed along to her own African-American students in Harlem the same capacity for pianistic self-expression born of strength, Bonds' own emphasized word, that characterized the pianism of Vladimir Horowitz, Arthur Rubinstein, and Lavoie-Herz herself. Click. She also concertized actively, especially in benefit concerts, including a historic concert at New York's Town Hall titled The Negro Salute to the Fighting Jews of Europe. Most importantly, though, she renewed her work as a classical composer, especially one whose music would give proud and authentic voice to her Black heritage. Click. The Creek Freedmen spirituals, commissioned by Hortense Love in 1941, were finally published in 1946. Click. And with an eye to those spirituals, around 1950, click, She likened her lessons to her efforts to give authentic and modern voice to the beliefs and lived experiences of African Americans to J.S. Bach's approach to the chorales that expressed the identity of Protestant Germans and Franz Liszt's musical celebrations of the Romani Gypsies of Hungary, quoting here from those reflections. Instead of merely harmonizing melodies with chord progressions typical of the Romantic school, it is a challenge to develop these melodies as Liszt did Hungarian folk melodies or Bach did with the German folk melodies, and also to express the emotions of the Negro people who live and work and move on the city streets. It is a challenge to take melodies of a past day and echo them with the harmonies of the present and the future, and additionally, express the experiences one has really lived through, in reality, to express the moods and drives of all humanity, end quote. Click. These efforts paid off. Her piano studio grew to encompass between 20 and 30 students, that's a big studio, and her renown as a performer and composer soared, which brings us to a special moment in this presentation. In the early 1950s, the United States Department of State invited Margaret Bonds to curate and perform as pianist in a Voice of America radio broadcast. That recorded broadcast was subsequently pressed to a 16-inch transcription disc, and last August, I was able to procure a copy of that album. All this means that you, my friends, will now be among the very first listeners in modern memory to hear Margaret Bonds herself playing her own music. This is an early version of her piano setting of Dry Bones, which eventually became the first movement of her virtuosic spiritual suite for piano. And there is a sound example here. Please click. This is a remarkable recording, really, partly because it gives a vivid picture of Margaret Bonds' formidable skills as pianist, but also because it shows the sheer style with which she pressed the established conventions of the European-American tradition of the piano fantasy into the service of African-American vernacular music, in this case, the spiritual Dry Bones. Click. The next high point was probably her solo performance at New York's Town Hall on February 7th, 1952. Click. And this led to a long string of solo performances and collaborative performances. There we go. That kept the Bonds mission before the musical public, unfailing with an emphasis on integrating Black and white musical styles. Click. The most important immediate fruit of this professional ascent was her first collaboration with Hughes in 14 years. Click. A new Christmas cantata centered on the Black Magus Balthazar, the Ballad of the Brown King. Click. That cantata's premiere on December 12, 1954, click, with Margaret Bonds at the piano, made history. Although the white press predictably ignored it, in the African-American press, it created a sensation. Click, with pianist, composer, and critic Carl Dighton singling out the cantata's clear, iridescent harmonies, end quote, and veteran journalist Gladys P. Graham publishing a syndicated article, click, titled, It Happened in New York. Click. More tangibly, the cantata's success combined with Margaret Bonds' existing reputation to persuade the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, ASCAP, to elect her to full membership, a professional milestone that led Bonds to write to her friend, Leontine Price, that the election made her feel a grave responsibility because she was only the second woman of color in classical music ever to have been elected to that organization. Indeed, although many channels of musical power remained closed to Bonds because of her race and her sex, even after this election, the ASCAP election did open new doors for her, and as a result, she was now able to publish more arrangements of spirituals, more art songs, and more popular songs than previously. Click. Even the death of her beloved mother, Estella Bonds, in 1957 slowed her down only briefly. Click. For in her grief, she not only produced her extraordinary and now universally beloved setting of He's Got the Whole World in His Hand, which you can find all over YouTube and other venues if you're interested, but also enrolled in advanced studies at the Juilliard School with Robert Starrer. Click. And then another quick click. She also composed a work that would have won the approval of her more musically conservative mother and that was unlike anything she had ever written before. Click. The Mass in D minor. Click. The premiere of two movements from that extraordinary composition on March 15th, 1959, so impressed Langston Hughes that he penned an important article for the national edition of the Chicago Defender, praising the work and holding it up as an example of why Black churches should invest in commissioning new works by contemporary Black composers. Click. And there's more, for the Mass in D minor was followed by a steady stream of other remarkable works. Click. These included her beautiful setting of Hold On, Click, and the orchestration of He's Got the Whole World in His Hand that Leontine Price would issue on her historic 1961 album of spirituals. Click. They also included new art songs on poems from Edna St. Vincent Millay and Robert Frost, Click, and the three dream portraits on texts of Langston Hughes, which is actually the first composition by Margaret Bonds that I heard back in 1985-86. Click. And then the year 1960 saw the premiere of a revised and extended version of the Ballad of the Brown King, a performance that made national news and attracted so much attention that Sam Fox Music, which was then the second largest music publisher in the United States, quickly snapped it up and published it in 1961. Click. We're now turning the corner into the last decade of Margaret Bonds' life, and as we do so, I'd like to allude to one of her best-known spirituals by telling you to hold on. For in these final years, the Bonds mission comes into focus with a force and vibrancy even greater than before. The simplest illustrations of this fact are two other compositional milestones whose existence has long been known and that Bonds heard performed during her lifetime, but that remained unpublished at her death and unheard for many years thereafter. The first of these, Click, is the Montgomery Variations, which was inspired during a tour of the Deep South in 1963 and completed during the passage or following the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. This work offers a series of musical snapshots of key moments in the civil rights movement, from the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it valorizes Bonds' poor and Black contemporaries, most of them anonymous to history, who undertook to challenge the segregation and systemic racism of their world and managed, through prayer, faith, strength, and perseverance, to bring about meaningful social change for millions of others. The work was performed in San Francisco in 1967, but the lack of publishing opportunities for African-American women's large-scale works then silenced it for about half a century. Click. It was finally published by Hildegard Publishing Company in 2020, Click, and in 2021, it received its first recorded performance by a professional orchestra. This was the Minnesota Orchestra under the direction of Scott Gu. It was in 2022, it was performed on average every 19 days, which is amazing for a work that had been silent for the previous half century. Just last fall, it received its world premiere commercial recording, this by the Royal Scottish National Orchestra under the baton of Sir Kellen Gray. Click. The other large-scale product, or perhaps summation of the Bonds mission as this had come to exist by the early 1960s, is Bonds' setting of the iconic civil rights credo of W.E.B. Du Bois, Click. Composed in 1964-65, Click, the credo begins with a powerful choral proclamation that I believe in God, who made of one blood all nations that on earth do dwell, and I believe that all men, black and brown and white, are brothers, varying through time and opportunity in form and gift and feature, but differing in no essential particular, and alike in soul and the possibility of infinite development. Then, in one of the most exquisitely beautiful gospel songs ever written, the credo reflects that especially do I believe in the Negro race, the beauty of its genius, the sweetness of its soul, and its strength in that meekness which shall yet inherit this turbulent earth. It then decries the work of the devil and his angels and proclaims to a world that was witnessing the horror of the thousands of lives lost to the undeclared Vietnam War, that I believe that war is murder, that armies and navies are at bottom the tinsel and braggadocio of oppression and wrong, and that the wicked conquest of weaker and darker nations by nations whiter and stronger but foreshadows the death of that strength. And it closes with a vision of perseverance that will someday lead to divinely ordained joy in a world in which racism, the devil, war, and colonialist exploitation have yielded to the will of God. I believe in patience, patience with the weakness of the weak and the strength of the strong, the prejudice of the ignorant and the ignorance of the blind, patience with the tardy triumph of joy and the mad chastening of sorrow, patience with God. Like the Montgomery Variations, though, this extraordinary musical social justice manifesto disappeared for a time. It was discussed in an important dissertation in 2003, and then it remained unheard for another 17 years before Click, finally being published by Hildegard Publishing Company in 2020. Since then, there has been a veritable explosion of performances of the credo around the United States and in Europe, and it would appear that Margaret Bonds' setting of Credo 2 is finally here to stay. To give you just a small taste, Click, of the beauty and power of musical expression that made Bonds' music so extraordinary, Click, here is the last movement of the Credo, performed by the Southwestern University Chorale, directed by Dr. Holly Dalrymple, together with the Austin Civic Orchestra under the baton of Dr. Louis Ferrari. I hope you'll enjoy this, and then please play.
Oh
final chapter of Margaret Barnes's career emerged out of the ashes. Click. Ashes that had been smoldering on the opposite coast of the United States for 2 years. Click. On August 7th, at 7 p.m. on August 11th, 1965, a 20-year-old African-American man, Marquette Frye, was pulled over in the inner-city Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles for drunken driving. Before a crowd of onlookers, he failed a sobriety test, was struck in the face with a baton by a white police officer, fell to the ground, and was handcuffed and hustled into a police car. When his mother showed up and tried to stop the police from forcing him into their car, the police arrested her and forced her into the car. And when his stepbrother peacefully asked the police not to arrest his mother, he was handcuffed and forced into another car. All this happened before a growing crowd, with growing numbers of police officers armed with shotguns and batons, and growing numbers of sirens and flashers that attracted more to the growing confrontation. Click. 45 minutes later, the uprising that would be nationally televised and reported on as the Watts Rebellion was in full swing. Click. Over the next 6 days, civil unrest involving 34 deaths, more than 1,000 injuries, and 4,000 arrests with property damage in excess of $40 million, which is about $388 million today, spread over a curfew zone that encompassed more than 45 square miles. More than 14,000 California National Guard troops were mobilized to try to restore calm. These events, nationally televised and reported in the national press, could not have escaped Margaret Barnes, who knew well about corrupt, violent policing and the societal consequences of poverty through her own upbringing on the south side of Chicago and her adult life in Harlem. And she, like all persons of goodwill, must have been heartsick at the loss of life and livelihood that attended those riots. Click. But out of those ashes arose a new dream, the Los Angeles Inner City Cultural Center, the nation's first and most influential minority-owned and operated multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multidisciplinary visual and performing arts institution. That center was a large-scale, high-profile, federally funded enactment of the very same ideas and ideals that Margaret Barnes herself had first brought to fruition 3 decades earlier in the Allied Arts Academy in Chicago. She was thrilled, and now in 1966, she realized that her voice, her mission, called on her to leave the established comforts of her success and New York. Click. That was easier said than done, for she was now, click, an extraordinarily successful performer and composer, and had a long string of calendar commitments that had to be performed. These included performances of her music around the United States, Europe, and in the African homeland. And among those was the first ever all Barnes concert in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Click. In January 1967, another honor occurred when she received prestigious Alumni Merit Award from Northwestern University, where she had been so viciously ostracized in the 1930s. Nevertheless, her mission called. So while completing her extensive slate of existing commitments, she continued laying plans to relocate to Los Angeles, which by 1970 would be home to the second largest Black population by region in the entire country. Finally, in November of 1967, she packed a suitcase and she reminded Larry Richardson to save receipts for postage on anything that he sent her, and she moved to Los Angeles. Once there, she rented a small apartment just minutes from the Inner City Cultural Center and just minutes from where Marquette Frye had been arrested in 1965, right in the heart of the Watts district that had been home to those riots. Click. Thus, Margaret Barnes began her career anew again. Click. With her friend Janice LaVos, she composed Bright Star, a Christmas choral prayer for peace, obviously tendered in protest of the Vietnam War. Click. As well as 2 jazz-influenced popular songs, click, that were done by the great jazz vocalist Peggy Lee. She also produced, click, a series of brilliant spiritual settings commissioned by the great soprano Leontine Price, as well as, click, a major orchestral composition, which is now lost, for the Southeast Symphony Orchestra, click, and click, a major orchestral work in response to a commission from the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. Click. But perhaps the most remarkable work in these final years was a collaboration that yielded a new 19-number musical that, like The Ballad of the Brown King, celebrated Blacks in history. But the hero of this musical was a Black woman, Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley, who was born into enslavement but used her skills in dressmaking and business to secure her own freedom and that of her son, and then became one of the country's most sought-after dressmakers, an author, and an activist. This musical, titled Bitter Laurel, stalled when one of Bonds' collaborators went on an extended trip that precluded the teams making further revisions, and Margaret Bonds died before they could resume work on it. Even so, the musical as we have it is fully performable, and yet it remains unpublished and unperformed to this day, and it's never even been mentioned in any of the biographical or musical literature on Margaret Bonds. Now, obviously, those final years in California were a period of prodigious artistic growth and personal fulfillment for Margaret Bonds. The quality, quantity, and diversity of the projects that populated her life in Los Angeles reveal a creative artist whose genius and aspiration, or rather, and imagination, were ascending to new heights. Had she lived longer, there's no telling what might have come next. Click. But she did not live longer. She died suddenly of a heart attack on April 26, 1972. She was 59 years old. The voice and vision of Margaret Bonds, irrepressible in life, were no more. Margaret Bonds' life was mourned around the world. In her adopted home of Los Angeles, the Inner City Cultural Center, where she had composed, worked, and taught for the past 3 years, opened its doors from midnight to dawn in the days after her death so that friends and fellow artists could pay tribute to the deceased composer. Newspapers around the United States reported on her passing, and memorial services were held in no fewer than 11 major cities, including Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. Northwestern University, that 1930s cesspool of white supremacy that in 1967 had conferred its prestigious Alumni Merit Award on her, sent out a special notice of her death to its alumni. And the president of the National Association of Negro Musicians sent a lengthy letter to the members of that association mourning the passing of one of NAM's most brilliant, committed, and ingenious and distinguished friends. Quote, the reasons for this tide of mourning and celebration of life are obvious, click, and given Margaret Bonds' nearly complete erasure from the annals of music history since her death, instructive, click. Margaret Bonds was not only the first African-American woman to perform with the all-white and all-male Chicago Symphony Orchestra, click, nor was she only the composer of more than 400 compositions that, in spite of the white and male-dominated political economy of music publishing, were widely performed in manuscript throughout the United States and in Europe from the mid-1930s to early 1970s. Click. Nor was she only one of the first African-American women to have her music broadcast on European radio, click, and the first African-American woman to have her music performed widely in Africa, click. Nor was she only the second African-American woman in classical music to be elected to full membership in ASCAP, click. Only the first woman, black or white, to win not 1 or 2, but 3 awards from that predominantly white and predominantly male organization, click. Nor was she only a composer who, over the course of 4 decades, used her music to push back, click. Oh, well, I'll just talk through this one. Nor was she only a composer who, over the course of 4 decades, used her music to push back against the barriers that segregated popular and classical, male and female, stereotypically black and stereotypically white musics out from one another. Nor was she only the musical voice of Langston Hughes, nor was she only the composer of many other the teacher of many other 20th century notables. Margaret Bonds was much more than all of these things, remarkable though they are, and yet, and this is where I close. See, Judy, I am listening. Those history-making achievements and the international renown that Margaret Bonds accrued during her lifetime stand in stark contrast to what our world today knows and hears of her voice, her vision, her mission. Although Bonds' music is of comparable or greater quality to that of other, now canonical mid-20th century composers, including Ives, Copland, and Bernstein, and others, and although it engages more persistently than theirs with societal themes that are still of central importance, not a single one of the mainstream music history textbooks and music theory textbooks that provide the foundation for every single music major and minor's education in the United States even mentions Margaret Bonds, not a single one. She fares little better in studies specifically devoted to 20th century music and American music generally. In point of fact, those same forces that during her lifetime created and perpetuated the privilege of composers white and male have worked continually since her death, both to perpetuate those composers' privilege and to marginalize Margaret Bonds, her legacy, her mission, which is where you come in. By attending this little talk, you've undertaken to listen anew to a voice that has remained largely unheard, to give space to the message borne by that voice, and to right a great wrong that has deprived so many of today's musicians of a legacy that is every bit as much of and for our time as it is of the mid-20th century. And by choosing to spend this past hour here, you have elected to become part of the growing community of those who partake of the beauty, the strength, and the mission that are the legacy of Margaret Bonds. If you're interested by what you've heard and seen here today, I hope you'll follow through on new releases and new radio coverage of her and her music. And I hope you will tell others. Together, we can undo the great wrong of her silencing. Together, we can tell the world. Click. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions?
First of all, thank you so much. I did not know anything about Margaret Bonds, and just you sharing this has really motivated me to learn more about it. How did you become interested in her?
So I first heard her music at a recital that I sort of wandered. I first heard her music at a recital that I sort of wandered into at a church in Tallahassee, Florida in the mid-1980s. I went to a lot of recitals. Everything else on that recital was music by, the familiar people. There was Schubert and Schumann and Fauré probably and so on. But that recital also included Margaret Bonds' 3 dream portraits on text of Langston Hughes, and it included Florence Price's Songs to the Dark Virgin. And even though I knew a lot of music, I was a master's student in musicology and had been listening voraciously for a long time, I had never heard those composers' names. I had never heard a note of their music. And I was thunderstruck by the immediacy and the originality of what I heard, how beautiful it was. So I started over the course of, then actually, I went back from there to my work at the Florida State University Music Library and started trying to find more music by Margaret Bonds and Florence Price. And I was very frustrated because even though the writings that I could find with the resources that were available in the mid-1980s made clear that both composers had written a lot of music, I could only lay hands on 5 or 6 pieces by each. And that annoyed me, right? I put that very nicely. So I started trying to find more. And over the course of the coming decades, I just built databases and aware of the learning curve that I had because I have been taught to understand everything except those composers, right? And so that's where it all started. And I have to tell you that as I tell you right now, these about 40 years later, about that performance, that one recital that I wandered into by accident in Tallahassee on that warm spring night, I'm still getting tingles, right? That's how powerful the effect was on me. So thank you for giving me a chance to say that. Okay.
I think you said that she was the second Black woman to be a member of that elite organization. Just out of curiosity, so I have a name, who was the first?
The first one was Florence Price, who had died 2 years before Margaret Bonds was elected.
Thank you again for a very fascinating and interesting class. My question is, how did I manage through 50 years to keep her alive and give her the proper recognition and credit? Who did all of this to the last 50 years? I know you mentioned organizations, but it's really wonderful to know that, there's been an effort to give her proper credit for what her genius was.
Yes, thank you for that. So that's an important point that it's on the cutting room floor from working together this talk, right? So there are works of Margaret Bonds, such as the setting of He's Got the Whole World in His Hand, which every one of you here, I promise, has heard many, many times. There are works like that that have remained popular, done all over the place, and arranged and rearranged throughout all these years. And in particular, the African American community of musicians who have always been aware that in Margaret Bonds they had an extraordinary, brilliant composer, have kept her name and her music alive by performing the music that is out of print, but using photocopies, right? It has continued to circulate by means of those side channels, right, over all these years. And the task now, I think, is really to take it so that the many works that even those stewards of her legacy never heard, never knew about, such as Bitter Laurel, right, are now taken from manuscripts, which they languish in 4 or 5 major archives and a whole bunch of private collections, and put into print so that they can be, most importantly, taught. Because today's, or rather, let me put it this way, tomorrow's teachers will teach what they learned as students, right? So once that music is out of manuscript and can be picked up for, reasonable prices, and that's where the burden is on publishers, then it will be something that can enter the mainstream of musical life, where it actually was, to a certain extent, during Margaret Bond's lifetime. Again, she had funeral services in 11 major cities of the United States, places that she had never even been to, gave memorial services for Margaret Bonds. So the fact that we know so little about her and so little of her music now is just simply a matter of erasure. If you imagine one of those great big pink erasers that people use, that's what has happened to Margaret Bonds in the half century since her death, right? And it's time to stop it. We can change that.
I'm curious to know her daughter and what her daughter studied and whether she followed in any musical footsteps.
So that is a wonderful question. Her daughter lived in New York to the end of her days, and her daughter was an artist. She composed, but we don't have any of that music, but her vocation, her trade, she made her living as a teacher, a school teacher, I think high school teacher up in New York. She was killed suddenly in a car wreck in 2011. And like Margaret Bonds herself, she died without a will. There's a moral in that, right? Which means that the materials of her mother that she had in her apartment went for a long time, 4 years, into an unclaimed freight warehouse in New York City before they finally passed to her landlord, who also owned that warehouse. And her landlord, who did have a will, had arrangements for all of her stuff to be auctioned. And for those reasons, 2 of the major collections of Margaret Bonds materials ended up in the Yale University libraries and in Georgetown University. I have to tell you one other fascinating thing about this, because the Georgetown University collection is an illustration of victory seized from the jaws of defeat. That's stuff that the Yale University libraries did not pick up went to a book fair, which is wholesale for books, right? It's not where you and I would go to buy books. It's where book dealers go to buy books and rarities. And it did not sell. That book fair was in Washington, D.C., and because it did not sell, Margaret Bonds materials, including the credo that you just heard, by the way, were left beside the dumpster at the end of the fair on Sunday night. That dumpster was to be emptied the next morning in Washington, D.C. But overnight, some collector, whose name I know but don't remember, came by and was snooping. Apparently, he made a practice of this, saw the boxes of Margaret Bonds materials, thought they looked interesting, snagged them, and passed them to a couple of Washington, D.C. antiquarian dealers, who then connected the Georgetown University libraries, who sold it. But literally, that music, which includes, by the way, about 100 letters from Langston Hughes, right, that missed the landfill by hours. if I saw a movie about that, read a short story about that, I would think this is silly. It doesn't happen. But it actually did happen in that case.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your patience with the clicks.
Our next class will start at 10:30.